What happens when a corrupt cop picks the wrong target? When a powerful judge thinks he's untouchable? One false accusation. And a father who won't back down. Stay with us. Because this fight for justice is about to get brutal. Ava Carter had always loved picking out birthday gifts for her mom. It was a tradition, just the two of them, spending hours debating over what felt right. This year, she wanted something special, something that showed how much she appreciated her. That's why she found herself at Bellamy's, an upscale jewelry store in the heart of Atlanta. The kind of place where the glass cases sparkled a little too perfectly. And the sales associates watched you a little too closely. She stepped inside, the chime of the entrance bell soft but precise, as if even the sound had to meet a certain standard. The store wasn't crowded, just a few customers here and there. Most of them older, well-dressed, the kind of people who belonged. She tried not to let it bother her. Ava was 16, confident, and used to holding her own in situations where she wasn't exactly welcomed. She ran her fingers over a delicate silver bracelet, imagining her mother's reaction when she opened the box. But something made her pause. A feeling, like the weight of someone's gaze pressing against her back. She turned slightly, just enough to glance over her shoulder without being obvious. That's when she saw her. A woman, elegant but cold, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that studied Ava with interest, too much interest. She was speaking quietly to one of the employees, her gaze flicking back to Ava every so often. Ava straightened her posture. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but the way they were looking at her made her feel like she had. The sales associate, a thin man in a navy suit, finally approached her. His smile tight. "Can I help you find something?" His voice was polite, but there was something else there. Something that made her stomach tighten. "I was just looking," she said, returning the bracelet to its velvet stand. "Thank you, though." The man nodded but didn't step away. He lingered, just long enough to make it clear that he wasn't entirely convinced. Ava took a slow breath. She didn't need this. Not today. Maybe not ever. She glanced back at the woman. The one who was still watching her. The woman said something to the sales associate in a tone too low to catch. But Ava saw the way his expression stiffened slightly. That was enough. She didn't like the feeling curling in her stomach. "Actually, I think I'll come back later," Ava said, forcing a small smile before turning toward the exit. She kept her head high as she walked past the woman. Even without looking directly, she felt the way the woman's gaze followed her all the way to the door. The outside air hit her like a shock, cool compared to the stiff, perfumed air of the store. She exhaled, shaking off the discomfort. It was fine. She was fine. She had barely taken 3 steps down the sidewalk when a voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the hum of the city. "Hold it right there." Ava turned, her pulse skipping. A police officer stood in front of her, blocking her path. Not just any officer. She recognized the name on his badge before he even spoke again. Ethan Grayson, Atlanta PD. His tone was calm, but there was a weight behind it that made her uneasy. "Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Grayson's gaze swept over her, assessing. "There sure is," he said. "We've got a report of shoplifting. You're gonna need to come with me." Ava felt her breath catch, the weight of the accusation slamming into her. Ava's pulse pounded as she stared up at the officer blocking her way. Ethan Grayson stood tall, his uniform crisp, his posture radiating the kind of authority that didn't invite argument. His hand rested on his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. "You were inside Bellamy's just now?" His voice was even, but there was something in his tone that made Ava's stomach tighten. She forced herself to nod. "Yeah, I was looking for a birthday gift for my mom." Grayson tilted his head, watching her the way a cat watches a trapped mouse. "Is that so? Because we got a call about a possible theft. You match the description." Ava blinked, the accusation slamming into her like a physical blow. "What? I didn't take anything." A few passers-by had already slowed down, their eyes darting between the officer and the teenage girl standing frozen on the sidewalk. Grayson didn't seem to mind the growing attention. If anything, he welcomed it. "Open your bag," he ordered. Ava's fingers tightened around the strap slung over her shoulder. "No," she said before she could stop herself. "You don't have any reason to search me." Grayson let out a quiet chuckle, like she had just said something amusing. I think we both know how this goes. He said, you make this easy, and I won't have to take you downtown. Now, bag, open it. Her breath came quicker now, shallow and uneven. She wasn't sure if it was fear or anger making her hands shake. Maybe both. Call my dad, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. If you think I did something wrong, he can come down here and... Your dad's not here, Grayson interrupted. But I am. Ava's heart pounded as she looked at the people gathering around. Some whispered, some just watched. No one stepped forward. The door to Bellamy's swung open behind her. The thin man in the navy suit, the store employee who had watched her so carefully inside, stepped out. His eyes darting toward Grayson. Officer, I don't want any trouble, he said, keeping his voice low. I only mentioned that the girl was looking at the bracelet. I never saw her take anything. Grayson didn't take his eyes off Ava. Then I guess we'll just make sure. A heavy silence settled over the street as Ava realized she had no choice. She unzipped her bag slowly, her fingers clenching the fabric as she pulled it open for him to see. Her wallet, a notebook, a pair of headphones, no bracelet, no stolen merchandise. Grayson stared at the contents for a long moment, his jaw working. Ava swallowed hard, her hands gripping the bag's edges so tightly her knuckles turned white. Satisfied? Before Grayson could answer, a voice cut through the tension. I'll take it from here. Ava turned so fast she nearly stumbled. Her father stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable but his presence undeniable. Daniel Carter was a man used to being in control of a room without raising his voice. Tall, broad-shouldered, his suit crisp but slightly unbuttoned at the collar, as if he had left somewhere in a hurry. His gaze locked onto Grayson, and something unspoken passed between them. Something tense. Something that felt like it had existed long before this moment. Grayson took a step back. Just a small one, but enough for Ava to see it. Agent Carter, he said smoothly, didn't realize you'd be joining us. Daniel didn't blink. You stopped my daughter, accused her of a crime. I'd like to see your probable cause. Grayson's expression flickered, just for a second, then the smirk was back. We received a call from a concerned citizen. A store employee just stated on record that he never saw her take anything. Daniel interrupted. So unless you have video footage, a witness, or anything remotely resembling evidence, you have no reason to detain her. The crowd had grown, people murmuring now. A couple of them even raised their phones. Recording. Grayson's jaw clenched. He let out a slow breath through his nose, as if considering his options. Finally, he took a step back. Looks like today's your lucky day, kid. Ava exhaled shakily. Grayson's gaze flicked back to Daniel, and his smirk returned. But you think this is over? I don't forget things like this. Agent Carter. He turned and walked away, his presence still lingering even after he disappeared down the street. Daniel didn't move for a long moment. When he finally looked at Ava, his expression softened just a fraction. You okay? Ava nodded, but her hands were still trembling. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Let's go home. They walked away together. But Ava couldn't shake the feeling that Grayson's words weren't just a threat. They were a promise. Ava tried to push the memory of that day out of her mind. She told herself it was over, that her father had handled it, that Grayson had backed off. But no matter how much she wanted to believe it, something inside her refused to settle. She noticed it first on the way to school. The feeling, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. At first, she thought she was being paranoid, letting the fear of what had happened cloud her judgment. But then she saw it. A police cruiser, parked just down the street from their house, engine idling. It wasn't unusual to see officers in their neighborhood, but this one was different. It had been there the day before, too, and the day before that. She didn't tell her dad right away. Maybe it was nothing, maybe she was imagining things. But then, a week later, she saw him. She had just stepped out of school, backpack slung over one shoulder, when she spotted Grayson leaning casually against his patrol car. He wasn't in uniform this time, just a dark jacket, hands tucked into his pockets. He didn't move, didn't approach her, he only watched. She hesitated, pulse hammering, before forcing herself to walk past him like he wasn't there. When she was only a few steps away, he smiled, not a friendly smile, a knowing one. A promise. Ava didn't look back. That night, at the dinner table, she barely touched her food. Daniel noticed. He always did. You all right? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. The same one he used when he knew something wasn't right. Ava hesitated, then put her fork down. He was at my school today, she said. Daniel's expression barely changed, but she saw the way his fingers curled slightly, his grip tightening around his knife. Grayson? She nodded. He didn't say anything, just stood there. Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he pushed his plate away and stood. Ava watched as he walked to his office, heard the sound of his computer booting up. Daniel Carter wasn't just a father. He was an investigator, and something about all of this wasn't sitting right with him. He had already run Grayson's name once after the incident, but this time, he dug deeper, and what he found made his stomach turn. Ethan Grayson had a history. Not of arrests, not of disciplinary action, nothing that would have officially flagged him as a problem. But his name kept appearing in reports. Incidents involving young black men falsely accused, detained, threatened, cases that had never made it to court, victims who had never pressed charges. And then there was Bellamy's. Daniel cross-referenced Grayson's records with past incidents at the store where Ava had been accused. There were patterns, names that showed up more than once, reports of theft that led nowhere. Every case involved a person of color. And in every case, the officer on the scene had been Grayson. This wasn't random. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something stank. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something told him to answer. The voice on the other end was low, distorted. You need to stop looking. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? A pause. Then, you're digging where you shouldn't be. Let it go, Carter, for your sake, and your daughter's. The line went dead. Daniel sat in the silence, staring at the screen. He had just found his answer, and there was no way in hell he was letting it go. Daniel was sipping his first cup of coffee when the knock came. It wasn't the hesitant kind. It was hard, deliberate, an announcement rather than a request. He glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. Nothing good ever happened this early. By the time he reached the door, he already knew who it would be. Ethan Grayson stood on his porch, uniform perfect, badge gleaming under the soft morning light. Behind him, two more officers flanked the doorway, one holding a clipboard. Daniel didn't open the screen door. Something I can help you with? Grayson smiled, slow and easy. Actually, yeah, we got a warrant. Daniel's grip tightened on the doorframe. A warrant for what? Search and seizure, Grayson said, tapping the clipboard. Seems we have a credible witness who claims your daughter stole from Bellamy's. Ava appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair still messy from sleep. She looked down at them, eyes wide, then back at her father. I didn't take anything, she said, voice firm but laced with unease. Daniel kept his gaze on Grayson. This witness, let me guess. Anonymous? Grayson chuckled. Oh, they exist. All right, and they're willing to testify. He leaned in just slightly. I know how to get people to tell the truth. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, forcing Grayson to take a step back. You want to search my house? Fine, but when you find nothing, this ends. And if you try to intimidate my daughter again, you and I will have a very different conversation. Grayson held his gaze for a moment, then signaled to the officers. Go ahead. Daniel watched as they moved inside. He knew exactly what they'd find. Nothing. But that wasn't the point. Was it? This wasn't about evidence. This was about control. The officers went through drawers, closets, even checked inside the kitchen cabinets as if Ava had stashed a stolen bracelet next to the cereal boxes. The entire time, Ava sat stiffly on the couch, arms crossed, eyes flashing between anger and anxiety. 15 minutes later, one of the officers returned, shaking his head. Nothing here. Daniel folded his arms. Told you. Grayson barely reacted. He took his time adjusting the cuffs on his sleeves before nodding toward Ava. Guess you got lucky, kid. Daniel took a step forward, lowering his voice so only Grayson could hear. You keep trying to push this, and I'm going to push back, harder than you're ready for. Grayson's smirk faltered just slightly before he turned to leave. See you around, Carter. Daniel watched them go, his gut twisting. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat across from Thomas Reeves in a quiet booth at a diner on the west side of town. Reeves was one of the few people in the FBI Daniel still trusted. You're telling me a cop shows up at your house with a bogus search warrant? And you don't think he's working alone? Reeves asked, stirring sugar into his coffee. Daniel exhaled through his nose. I don't just think it. I know it. Reeves took a sip, watching him over the rim of his cup. If Grayson has protection from higher up, this could be more than just a rogue cop with a grudge. Daniel nodded. I need to know who's backing him. Reeves set his coffee down. I'll dig around, see what I can find. But you should know, this kind of thing? It doesn't just happen overnight. If Grayson has been getting away with this for years, someone's been covering for him. Daniel already knew that, he just needed proof. A few hours later, back in his office, Daniel started pulling old case files, searching for anything with Grayson's name attached. It didn't take long before something jumped out at him. A case from 5 years ago. A young black man, Marcus Hill, arrested under suspicious circumstances. The charge? Theft. The officer on duty? Ethan Grayson. Marcus Hill had been released from custody the next morning. And then, a week later, he vanished. Daniel sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop screen casting sharp shadows across his face. The name Marcus Hill stared back at him from an old case file. Buried beneath years of bureaucracy and neglect, Marcus had been 17 when he was arrested. The official report said he had been caught stealing from a convenience store. Though no stolen goods were ever recovered, the officer who arrested him, Ethan Grayson, Marcus had been held overnight at the precinct and released the next morning. 1 week later, he was gone. No sightings, no leads, just vanished. His family had filed a missing persons report, but nothing ever came of it. Daniel leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. He had seen cases like this before. Young black men caught up in the system, then discarded when no one was looking. But this wasn't just another statistic. This was a pattern. He needed to speak to someone who knew Marcus. That led him to a small, run-down house on the south side of Atlanta, where the front yard was more dirt than grass and the porch sagged under its own weight. The woman who answered the door had tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much loss. Linda Hill? Daniel asked, keeping his voice gentle. She studied him for a moment before nodding. You're with the police? FBI, he corrected. I'm not here to reopen old wounds. But I need to ask you about your son. Linda's expression hardened. My son is dead. Daniel hesitated. Do you know that for sure? Linda exhaled, leaning against the doorframe. They never found him. But boys like Marcus, when they disappear, they don't come back. Daniel nodded slowly. What do you remember about the night he was arrested? She swallowed, arms wrapping around herself. He told me he didn't do it. Swore up and down that it was a setup. Said a woman had been watching him, following him around for days before he got picked up. I thought he was just scared. But now, she shook her head. I should have listened. Daniel frowned. A woman? Yeah, Linda said, wealthy looking, white. He didn't know her name. But she kept showing up. Said she gave him a bad feeling. Daniel's mind immediately went to Mrs. Lancaster, the same woman who had been at Bellamy's the day Ava was accused. Did Marcus ever say what he thought she wanted? Linda hesitated, then nodded. Right before he disappeared, he called me. He said he'd found something. Something big. He was scared. Daniel's stomach tightened. Found what? He wouldn't say. Just that he was gonna fix it. He was gonna make things right. Daniel thanked her and left, his mind racing. Marcus had known something. Something worth silencing him over. And Mrs. Lancaster had been involved. By the time he got home that night, exhaustion clung to him, but he barely had time to think before his phone buzzed. His bank. His accounts had been frozen. Pending investigation, the voice on the other end said. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. Then, moments later, Ava burst through the door, her face pale. Dad, I got suspended. Daniel's heart dropped. What? She held out a letter, hands shaking. Someone reported me, said I threatened a teacher. It's a lie. Daniel took the paper, skimming over the words. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an attack. Grayson, and whoever was protecting him, was trying to ruin them. Piece by piece. He was still gripping the letter when a knock at the door made him freeze. Ava looked at him, fear flickering across her face. Are you expecting someone? He wasn't. Daniel moved cautiously, peering through the peephole. No one was there, but when he opened the door, he found a small manila envelope sitting on the welcome mat. Frowning, he picked it up, stepping back inside before peeling it open. Inside was a single USB drive and a note, written in shaky handwriting. Marcus tried to tell the truth. Listen before it's too late. Daniel's fingers curled around the note, dread curling in his stomach. He plugged the drive into his laptop and clicked the single audio file. A voice crackled through the speakers, young, frantic, scared. They're lying. It's all fake. The thefts, the insurance claims, it's a scam. They're making money off of it, using guys like me as cover. If I disappear, it's because I got too close. Please, if anyone hears this. A sharp sound interrupted him. Then silence. Daniel sat back, heart pounding. Marcus had been trying to expose something, and someone had made sure he never got the chance. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night like a knife. Daniel had seen enough traffic stops in his career to know this wasn't routine. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he pulled over to the side of the empty road. His gut tightening. Seconds later, heavy footsteps approached his car. He rolled down the window and forced himself to stay calm. Step out of the vehicle, the officer ordered. Daniel didn't move. Mind telling me what this is about? A second officer came into view. This one, Daniel recognized instantly. Grayson. A slow smile spread across the officer's face. You're under arrest, Carter. Daniel exhaled sharply. For what? Grayson leaned down, resting his hands on the doorframe. Resisting an officer, interfering with an ongoing investigation. Take your pick. Daniel clenched his jaw. He knew better than to argue. These weren't real charges. This was a message. Step out, or I'll help you out. Grayson continued, tapping the side of the car. Daniel kept his expression neutral as he opened the door and stepped onto the pavement. The moment he did, Grayson grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. The cold bite of metal snapped around his wrist. Welcome to the system, Grayson murmured. Daniel was shoved into the back of the patrol car. His phone snatched from his pocket before he could think about calling anyone. The ride to the station was silent. By the time he was booked and processed, it was nearly midnight. His belongings were taken. His calls were denied. Then came the holding cell. The place stank of sweat and old cigarettes, and the flickering light overhead cast jagged shadows against the walls. There were 3 other men inside, 2 of whom eyed him immediately. Daniel sat on the metal bench, forcing himself to remain still. He was being watched. One of the men, tall and broad with a scar running down his cheek, stepped closer. You a cop? Daniel didn't answer. That's a cop's posture. The man continued, cracking his knuckles. I don't like cops. Daniel stayed quiet, his pulse steady. He had been in worse situations. The second man, wiry and restless, moved in from the side. He don't look scared. Scarface grinned. Then we should fix that. They lunged. Daniel exploded off the bench, dodging the first swing and slamming his elbow into the wiry man's ribs. The second one grabbed for his arm, but Daniel twisted, driving a sharp knee into his stomach. The fight was quick, controlled, over in less than 10 seconds. By the time the guards rushed in, Daniel was already stepping back, hands raised. The other 2 groaned on the floor. The cell door slammed shut again. But this time, the guards looked at Daniel differently. He wasn't just some cop who had been thrown in overnight. He was a problem. Ava had barely slept. Her father wasn't answering his phone. And the silence was worse than anything else. Something was wrong. She wasn't the kind of person to sit around and wait. If they were going to keep him locked up, she needed to do something. And that meant going back to where this all started. Bellamy's was closed by the time she got there. But the back alley was quiet. She had been watching the store long enough to know employees used a side door after hours. She kept to the shadows, waiting. Then, just as she was about to give up, a light flicked on inside. Through the narrow gap in the doorway, she heard a voice. Mrs. Lancaster. Ava crept forward, careful with each step. She pressed herself against the brick wall and listened. He's still locked up, but it won't last, Mrs. Lancaster was saying. We need more pressure. A low voice responded, but Ava couldn't make out the words. Then, clearer this time, Mrs. Lancaster laughed. My husband will handle it. He always does. Ava's stomach twisted. She had expected corruption, expected power plays. But a judge? She needed proof. Reaching into her pocket, she pressed record on her phone. Grayson has already done his part. Mrs. Lancaster continued. Now it's up to Charles. That was enough. Ava pulled back and hurried away from the building. Heart pounding. She didn't stop until she was far enough to breathe again. Then, with shaking hands, she sent the recording to the only person she trusted. Thomas Reeves. Reeves sat at his desk, listening to the audio for the third time. His face was unreadable, but his grip on the phone was tight. He knew that voice. Not Mrs. Lancaster's. The other one. A voice he had heard in high-profile cases before. A voice that belonged to someone untouchable. A federal judge. Reeves exhaled slowly. Daniel and Ava weren't just fighting against a dirty cop anymore. They were going up against a system designed to protect its own. Daniel stepped out of the precinct just as the morning sun broke through the gray Atlanta skyline. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, feeling the weight of the past 24 hours settle on his shoulders. The air was crisp, but it did nothing to cool the slow-burning anger simmering inside him. Thomas Reeves leaned against his car, arms crossed. He looked calm, but Daniel knew better. You okay? Reeves asked. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. Define okay. Reeves gave a slight nod, pushing off the car. You got lucky. Grayson wanted to keep you in there longer. But I made some noise. It won't hold forever, though. You rattled the wrong cages. Daniel exhaled, glancing around. I'm being watched. Yeah, Reeves muttered. They're not subtle about it either. Daniel's eyes landed on a dark sedan parked across the street. It had been there when he walked out, and it hadn't moved. The windows were tinted, the engine running. Unmarked. Reeves said, they want you to know they're watching. Daniel clenched his jaw. Who do they belong to? Reeves shook his head. Could be local, could be federal. If Lancaster's involved, they have more reach than we thought. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't have to. He already knew this wasn't just about Grayson anymore. This was bigger. Ava had been looking over her shoulder all day. The feeling had started that morning, an unease she couldn't shake. It wasn't just paranoia. It was something real. When she stepped out of school, she saw him. A man in his 40s. Built like an ex-military type. With a buzzed head and cold, assessing eyes. He was leaning against a black SUV across the street, pretending to check his phone. Except he wasn't. He was looking at her. Ava's fingers curled around the strap of her backpack as she stepped off the curb. The man moved at the same time, closing the distance too quickly. Walk away, he said, his voice low. Ava froze. You're poking around where you don't belong. He continued. I suggest you stop. For your sake. Ava's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay still. I don't know what you're talking about. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Sure you do. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, slipping into the waiting SUV. The vehicle pulled into traffic and disappeared. Ava stood frozen, watching until the taillights were gone. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She had memorized the license plate. She typed the numbers into a message and sent it straight to her father. Daniel didn't need long to track the SUV. It belonged to a security firm. Private, high-end, the kind used by people who had too much money and too many secrets. Ava's message had come with a short explanation, just enough to make Daniel's blood boil. He sat in his office, staring at the company's registration records. The name attached to the firm wasn't surprising. Charles Lancaster. Daniel leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. They weren't just being harassed. They were being hunted. His laptop chimed with a new email. No sender, no subject, just a single line in the preview. You know too much. Daniel clicked on it. Inside was a video file. His stomach clenched as he hit play. The footage was grainy, but the sound was clear. It showed a parking lot. Late at night, A figure was being escorted toward a large, unmarked van by 2 officers. Daniel recognized the face instantly. Marcus Hill. The timestamp was dated a week after Marcus had been released from police custody. Marcus hesitated, trying to pull back, but one of the officers shoved him forward. The back doors of the van swung open. And then, just before the video cut out, a second officer stepped into frame. Ethan Grayson. Daniel sat completely still. Marcus hadn't just disappeared, he had been taken. Daniel spotted Grayson as soon as he stepped out of the precinct. The officer moved with his usual arrogance, shoulders squared, chin high, as if the world bent to his will. But Daniel had seen men like him before, ones who mistook power for invincibility. He waited until Grayson was a few steps from his car before closing the distance. "Hey," Daniel called. Grayson turned, his face shifting into a slow smirk. "Agent Carter, I was wondering when you'd come knocking." Daniel didn't waste time. "Marcus Hill, you took him." Grayson tilted his head slightly, feigning curiosity. "Now why would I do that?" Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because he knew something worth killing for." Grayson's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched slightly at his side. "Attell, you have no idea what you're stepping into," Grayson said, "and if you had any sense, you'd walk away before you can't." Daniel stared at him, waiting. He wasn't leaving without something real. Grayson sighed, as if he were bored. "Look, I get it. You're a good father, a good agent. You think the law means something. But you're not up against some street thug. You're trying to take down a machine. And you're nothing more than a loose thread." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Then let's see what happens when I start pulling." For the first time, a flicker of something passed through Grayson's eyes, something close to doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You don't win this," Grayson said. "No one ever does." Then he stepped past Daniel, got into his car, and drove off. Daniel watched him go, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. Grayson wasn't the one in control. He was just protecting the real power. The man who sat behind a judge's bench, deciding what justice looked like. Charles Lancaster. Ava knew something was wrong the second she walked into her room. It was subtle, just the tiniest shift in the air. The way the blinds weren't quite how she had left them. Her books looked the same, her bed untouched. But the moment she took a step inside, she felt it. Then she saw the paper. A single sheet, folded neatly, resting on her pillow. Her stomach turned to ice as she picked it up. The message was handwritten, the letters jagged, as if someone had pressed too hard. "You're next." Ava's hands clenched around the note, her breath coming faster. Someone had been in here. In her space. In her home. She spun, rushing down the stairs. "Dad." Daniel was already moving before she finished speaking, his expression darkening the second he saw the paper. Reeves arrived within the hour. He took one look at the note and exhaled sharply. "This is an escalation," he said. Daniel barely glanced at him. "They've been escalating since day one." Reeves hesitated. "Let me take her in." Ava's stomach dropped. "What?" "Protective custody," Reeves clarified. "It won't be forever. Just long enough for us to figure out who's behind this." Daniel shook his head. "No." Reeves narrowed his eyes. "You're too close to this. That's exactly why she stays with me." Daniel shot back. "I'm not hiding. I'm ending this." Reeves sighed but didn't argue. Ava stood there, the note still clenched in her fingers, and knew one thing for sure. Whoever had been in her room, they weren't finished. Daniel's phone vibrated just after midnight. The number was blocked. The message short. "Want answers? Parking lot 14, 2 a.m. Daniel stared at the screen, then reached for his jacket. By the time he pulled into the lot, the place was nearly empty. The glow of a single street lamp flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement. A figure stepped out from behind a car. Daniel recognized him immediately. The man had worked at Bellamy's, and judging by the look on his face, he had a story to tell. Daniel parked his car at the far end of lot 14, his headlights off. The place was nearly deserted, save for a few flickering street lamps that cast long, uneasy shadows. He scanned the area, his hand hovering near the gun at his hip. Then he saw him. A man stood near a rusted-out sedan, his shoulders hunched, his head on a swivel. He was in his 50s, maybe early 60s, wearing a worn-out jacket that had seen better days. His hands were stuffed deep into his pockets. But even from a distance, Daniel could see them trembling. Daniel stepped out of his car and approached slowly. Elijah Moore? The man flinched at the sound of his name. He looked up, eyes darting around like he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. You the Fed? He asked, voice hoarse. Daniel gave a small nod. Yeah. Elijah let out a breath, glancing over his shoulder before speaking again. I don't got much time. If they find out I'm talking to you. His voice trailed off, and he shook his head. Who's they? Daniel asked, though he already had a good idea. Elijah let out a humorless laugh. Same people you've been poking around about. The Lancasters. That jewelry store? It's not just a store. It's a damn front. Daniel's jaw tightened. For what? Elijah swallowed hard, lowering his voice. Insurance fraud. The biggest damn scam you can think of. They stage thefts, file claims, collect the payouts. Millions. Gone right into their pockets. Daniel felt his stomach turn. He had suspected corruption, but this was more elaborate than he thought. And the people they accuse? Elijah's expression darkened. All black, all easy targets. Someone who doesn't have a lawyer. Someone who's already got a record. Hell. Someone like that kid, Marcus Hill. He wasn't the first. He was just the one who got too close. Daniel stiffened at the name. What do you mean? Elijah wiped a hand over his face. That boy figured it out. He came to me one night. Said he had proof. I told him to keep his mouth shut. But he was young. Thought if he did the right thing, people would listen. Daniel took a step closer. What happened to him? Elijah? The man hesitated. I don't know. Don't lie to me. Elijah looked away. I swear, I don't know for sure. But I know this. He never made it home that night. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Who gave the order? Elijah shook his head. I can't. Who? Elijah? The man finally looked up, his face pale under the streetlights. Who do you think? His voice was barely above a whisper. The judge. Daniel's breath left him in a slow exhale. He had suspected Charles Lancaster's involvement, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down his spine. Elijah took a shaky step back. I need to go. Wait. But the man was already turning, practically jogging toward his car. He fumbled with his keys, yanking the door open. Daniel knew better than to push. The man was terrified, and for good reason. He watched as Elijah sped off, his taillights disappearing into the night. Less than an hour later, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his stomach sinking at the notification. A local news alert. Pedestrian killed in a hit and run. Victim identified as Elijah Moore. Daniel gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. They were cleaning up loose ends. Daniel had been in the game long enough to recognize a setup when he saw one. And this? This had all the markings of one. The call came early, just as he was reviewing his notes on Elijah Moore's murder. The voice on the other end was crisp. Professional. Agent Carter. This is Assistant Director Ellis from the Bureau. You need to report to headquarters immediately. There are concerns regarding your recent actions. Daniel kept his voice steady. Concerns? We'll discuss in person. Ellis replied. Don't be late. Then the line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, jaw tightening. This wasn't a simple inquiry. This was a move to sideline him. And he had a good idea of who was behind it. The moment Daniel stepped into the FBI field office, he could feel the shift in the air. Eyes followed him. Whispers lingered a second too long. The tension was thick, like a room waiting for a storm. A secretary led him down a corridor to a glass-walled conference room. Inside, two men were already waiting. One of them was Assistant Director Ellis, a seasoned agent with a reputation for being by the book. The other was a man Daniel had only seen in briefings, Federal Prosecutor Richard Holloway. Holloway leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. Agent Carter, he said smoothly, gesturing to the seat across from him. Sit. Daniel remained standing. Let's skip the theatrics. What's this about? Ellis sighed. We've received reports that you've been interfering in an active federal investigation. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. Is that what we're calling it? Holloway's gaze sharpened. You've been conducting unauthorized inquiries into a case that does not fall under your jurisdiction. That ends today. Effective immediately. You are placed on administrative leave. Daniel clenched his jaw. You can't be serious. Turn in your badge and firearm. The room went silent. Daniel looked between the two men. Then exhaled slowly. This is coming from Lancaster. Isn't it? Holloway didn't blink. I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel scoffed. Of course you don't. The door behind him opened. A security officer stepped in. Waiting. Daniel reached into his jacket. Pulling out his badge, he set it on the table with more force than necessary. His sidearm followed. Ellis looked away. Holloway simply smiled. Smart choice. Agent Carter, he said. Daniel didn't respond. He turned and walked out. His pulse steady, but his blood boiling. Thomas Reeves was already waiting for him at a diner a few blocks from the field office. The moment Daniel sat down, Reeves slid a coffee across the table. Suspended? Reeves asked. Daniel smirked. Indefinitely. Reeves let out a low whistle. They're not playing around. Daniel leaned in. We need to go public. Reeves hesitated. That's a big move. It's the only move. Daniel countered. They've buried too much. Elijah's dead, and if we don't act fast, this whole thing disappears with him. Reeves exhaled, then nodded. I'll make a call. By the time Daniel stepped out of the diner, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. Then something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A glint, a feeling, more than anything, made him move. A shot rang out. Pain exploded in his shoulder, the force knocking him sideways. He hit the pavement hard, gasping as warmth spread down his arm. Another shot. This one struck the wall behind him. Daniel gritted his teeth, pushing himself up. His training kicked in before the pain could slow him down. He spotted a service alley to his left and sprinted, ignoring the fire burning through his shoulder. A car screeched nearby, then silence. Daniel pressed his back against the cold brick, breathing hard. Whoever had taken the shot was gone. But he didn't need to guess who had sent them. This wasn't a warning. It was an execution order. From Charles Lancaster himself. Daniel's vision blurred as he pressed a hand against his wounded shoulder, trying to ignore the sharp, burning pain. The bullet had gone through, missing bone, but the bleeding hadn't stopped. He had to move. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the alley. His pursuers weren't giving up. Forcing himself to his feet, he stumbled forward, his breath ragged. He needed a way out, a place to disappear. The street ahead was mostly empty, save for a few parked cars. He spotted a black sedan idling near the curb. Then, just as he took another step, the back door swung open. Get in, Reeves ordered. Daniel didn't hesitate. The moment he was inside, Reeves hit the gas, the tires screeching as they sped away. You look like hell, Reeves muttered. Daniel let out a strained chuckle. Feel worse. Reeves' expression darkened. That was a professional. Someone wanted you dead. Daniel leaned his head back, eyes shutting for a brief second. No guessing who. They holed up in an abandoned auto shop on the outskirts of the city. Daniel sat on an old workbench while Reeves worked quickly, disinfecting and stitching the wound. The bureau's compromised, Reeves said as he tightened the bandage. This isn't just Lancaster. Someone high up is protecting him. Daniel exhaled sharply. So if we go through official channels, we're dead before the ink dries. Reeves finished. Silence stretched between them. Daniel ran a hand over his face, frustration clawing at him. Meanwhile, Ava was under surveillance. His name was being dragged through the mud, and now he was a target for assassination. He needed a way to fight back. Then it hit him. Emily Foster. Emily Foster had built her career exposing corruption. Her articles had put city officials behind bars, forced resignations, and unearthed scandals that would have otherwise died in the dark. Daniel reached out through a burner phone. When she picked up, her voice was wary. Who is this? Daniel Carter. There was a pause. Then, the FBI agent who just got suspended. Daniel smirked. That's me. Emily exhaled through the receiver. Why'd I feel like you're about to ruin my week? Daniel didn't waste time. You've looked into Lancaster before. There was silence for a beat. Then, not over the phone. We meet in person. My location. My terms. An hour later, Daniel and Reeves met Emily in a dimly lit back room of a bar she used as a safe house for sources. She studied Daniel, eyes sharp. You're bleeding. Occupational hazard, he muttered. She sat across from him, arms crossed. I know Lancaster's dirty, but everything I've found is circumstantial. You have something better? Daniel pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table. A recording of Marcus Hill before he disappeared. He was trying to blow the whistle on Lancaster's fraud operation. Emily picked it up carefully. That's big. Daniel met her gaze. It's not enough. We need something solid, something that makes this impossible to bury. She drummed her fingers against the table. You think there's more? Daniel nodded. I know there is. That night, Daniel combed through his case files, desperation driving him forward. Then, buried deep in an archive folder, he found something. An old security tape. He played it, and his blood ran cold. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Marcus Hill, handcuffed, and Grayson. The officer was yelling, shoving Marcus against a wall, then slamming a baton into his ribs. Marcus collapsed, coughing. Then the video cut out. Daniel stared at the screen. It wasn't just proof of brutality. It was evidence of murder. Daniel paced inside the dimly lit room, his fingers tightening around his phone. The weight of the flash drive in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. This wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was a weapon. A weapon that could bring down Grayson, Lancaster, and the entire corrupt machine they had built. Across from him, Emily Foster sat with her laptop open, eyes scanning the video file he had just sent her. The glow of the screen reflected off her glasses. But even in the dim light, Daniel could see the shift in her expression. This is it, she whispered. This is the kind of thing that destroys careers. Ends lives. Daniel nodded. Then let's make sure it sees the light of day. Emily's fingers moved quickly, queuing up the file for distribution through her network. I can get this on every major platform within the next 3 hours, she said. But once it's out there, there's no turning back. Reeves, standing near the door, arms crossed, exhaled sharply. That's what worries me. Daniel turned to him. They're already trying to kill me. You think waiting will change that? Reeves hesitated. No, but it might give us time to prepare. Daniel shook his head. We don't have time. Emily tapped a final command on her keyboard, then looked up. It's set to go live at midnight. For the first time in days, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Then his phone buzzed. The number was blocked. He almost ignored it. Almost. He swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. Carter. A pause. Then a voice, calm and deliberate. You want your daughter back? Daniel's breath caught. His grip on the phone tightened. The voice continued, then shut it down. Silence filled the room. Reeves and Emily watched him, their expressions shifting as they read the change in his face. Daniel swallowed hard. Where is she? The voice on the other end chuckled softly. That's not the question you should be asking. The question is, how much do you love her? Daniel forced himself to stay calm. If you hurt her, we're not animals. The voice interrupted. We don't want blood. We want this to go away. You make that happen, and she walks free. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to yell, to threaten, but he knew better. He had dealt with men like this before. They didn't respond to rage. They responded to control. His voice came out steady. Give me proof she's alive. A pause. Then a soft rustling. Then, Dad? Ava's voice, shaky, scared. Daniel's stomach twisted. Ava, are you hurt? The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, his breath coming faster. Reeves was already moving. We need to find her. Now. Emily stood, eyes wide. What do we do about the video? Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them. We don't stop. Reeves hesitated. If we release it, they might kill her. Daniel turned to him, voice hard. If we don't, they'll kill her anyway. Less than an hour later, Reeves stormed into the room with his laptop open. I found her. Daniel rushed over. Where? Reeves turned the screen. A satellite image showed a rundown building on the outskirts of Atlanta. This place was owned by Lancaster's law firm for years. It was sold recently, but the deed was buried under shell corporations. Daniel's hands curled into fists. She's there. Reeves grabbed his keys. Then let's go get her. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the rundown house came into view. It sat in the middle of an overgrown lot, surrounded by rusting cars and broken fences. The kind of place no one would look twice at. Reeves studied the screen on his laptop. His expression grim. Thermal imaging shows at least 4 people inside. 2 near the entrance, 1 in the back, and 1 in the center. Daniel's stomach twisted. That's Ava. Reeves nodded. Most likely. But this isn't just a ransom grab. Carter, they're treating this like a kill mission. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then we make sure they don't walk out. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows. The air was thick, the night silent except for the distant hum of traffic. The house had only one real entry point, and the men guarding it weren't amateurs. Reeves tapped Daniel's shoulder, whispering, "I'll take the one on the left." Daniel barely nodded before moving. The first guard never saw it coming. Daniel's elbow struck the man's throat before he could react, his gun slipping from his fingers as he collapsed. Reeves handled the second one with a swift chokehold, easing his unconscious body onto the ground. They were inside. The air smelled of mildew and sweat. The floor creaked under their weight as they moved through the hallway. Daniel's pulse pounded. Then he saw her. Ava. She was tied to a chair, arms bound, her face pale. Small cuts lined her wrists where the rope had dug into her skin. Her eyes flickered up at him, relief crashing through the fear. "Dad." Before she could finish, a slow clap echoed through the room. "Grayson." He stepped from the shadows, gun raised, his smirk as smug as ever. "Took you long enough." Daniel positioned himself between Grayson and Ava. "You should have stayed in the shadows." "Grayson. Would have been safer for you." Grayson chuckled. "Come on, Carter. You think this ends with me?" Ava flinched as he waved the gun. Daniel didn't move. "Let her go," Daniel said evenly. Grayson tilted his head. "And what do I get in return?" Daniel's fingers twitched toward his holster. "I don't kill you." Grayson's smirk widened. "Tempting. But I have a better idea." Footsteps echoed behind him. Daniel turned as Mrs. Lancaster entered the room, her designer coat looking out of place in the filth of the house. She didn't carry a weapon. She didn't need one. Her voice was calm, almost amused. "Agent Carter, you really should have left well enough alone." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Where's your husband?" She smiled. "Busy." A screen flickered to life behind her. A live news broadcast. And there they were. Judge Charles Lancaster and his wife, smiling at a charity event, shaking hands, waving at the cameras. Mrs. Lancaster gestured toward it. "You see, while you've been running around playing hero, we've been securing our alibi. The world sees us here, doing good work. Meanwhile, you're breaking into private property, attacking law enforcement, and chasing ghosts." Daniel's stomach turned. They had planned this perfectly. Grayson grinned. "Now tell me, Carter, who do you think the world's going to believe?" Grayson's punch landed hard against Daniel's ribs, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his side. He staggered but didn't fall. He had taken worse. Grayson smirked. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Daniel wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and steadied himself. "Neither do you." The two men circled each other in the dimly lit room, their shadows stretching against the cracked walls. Outside, gunfire echoed through the night. Reeves was engaged in a shootout with one of Lancaster's men. Daniel couldn't worry about that now. His focus was on Grayson. Grayson lunged again. This time, Daniel was ready. He sidestepped, caught Grayson's arm, and drove his elbow into the man's face. Grayson stumbled, swearing as he wiped at his nose. Ava's scream cut through the chaos. Daniel's head snapped toward the sound. Ava had freed herself from the chair, but Grayson's attention had shifted to her. She bolted for the door, but Grayson was faster. "Get back here," he snarled, grabbing her by the arm. Ava twisted, desperate, then did the only thing she could think of. She sank her teeth into his wrist. Grayson roared in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She scrambled across the floor, eyes darting wildly. That's when she saw it. A gun. It had been knocked loose in the fight. Without thinking, she grabbed it. Grayson turned just as Ava stood, aiming the weapon at him with shaking hands. Daniel's heart pounded. "Ava, put it down." Her hands trembled, her breath shallow. "He was going to kill you." Grayson raised his hands slightly, eyes narrowing. "You're not going to shoot me, kid." For a long, tense second, no one moved. Then, with slow precision, Ava lowered the gun. The second she did, Daniel struck. His fist connected squarely with Grayson's jaw, sending him sprawling. Before the officer could recover, Daniel pinned him down, wrenching his arm behind his back. "Stay down," Daniel growled. Grayson groaned, his face pressed against the dirty floor. "This isn't over." Daniel tightened his grip. "Yeah, it is." Reeves stumbled into the room, clutching his side, blood seeping through his shirt. But he was smiling. In his other hand, he held up a small recording device. "Got the whole thing," Reeves said, breathless. "Every damn word." Daniel exhaled, relief washing over him. They had what they needed. Then the walls shook. A voice boomed from outside. "FBI, drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." Daniel's stomach dropped. The cavalry had arrived, but whose side were they on? The door burst open, and tactical officers flooded in, their rifles raised. Daniel immediately raised his hands, stepping away from Grayson. Ava did the same, eyes wide. Then, through the mass of agents, a man stepped forward, older, sharp-eyed, carrying himself with authority. Daniel recognized him. Deputy Attorney General Paul Whitaker. Whitaker's voice was steady. "It's over." For the first time in a long time, Daniel believed it. The news broke at dawn. Daniel sat on the edge of his hospital bed, one arm wrapped in a sling, as the morning broadcast played on the tiny television mounted to the wall. He didn't need to watch, he already knew what was coming. Still, hearing it out loud made it real. The shocking revelations surrounding Judge Charles Lancaster and his wife, socialite and business mogul Victoria Lancaster, have sent waves through the judicial and political landscape. The newly released footage, recorded by FBI Special Agent Thomas Reeves, has linked the Lancasters to a widespread insurance fraud scheme, unlawful police cover-ups, and even the disappearance of Marcus Hill. Daniel glanced at Ava, sitting cross-legged on the chair beside him, her eyes locked on the screen. The bruises on her wrists had begun to fade, but the fear in her eyes hadn't disappeared completely. She wasn't just watching the news. She was watching justice unfold. Reeves, leaning against the wall, let out a low whistle. "They're cooked." Daniel exhaled. Maybe. The footage Reeves had captured had been airtight. It showed Grayson's confession, the threats made by Mrs. Lancaster, and the overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Within hours, it had gone viral, sparking outrage across the country. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, demanding accountability. The governor called for an independent investigation into police misconduct. The FBI launched an internal review. The system was moving, but Lancaster wasn't a man who would go down quietly. By midday, the dominoes had begun to fall. Grayson was the first. The former officer was arrested at his home, dragged out in cuffs as cameras flashed around him. The official charges included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and involvement in Marcus Hill's disappearance. His face remained blank as he was shoved into the back of a squad car. But Daniel knew what was running through his mind. He had been untouchable for so long. Now, he was just another criminal. Hours later, Mrs. Lancaster surrendered herself to authorities. She didn't fight. She didn't beg. She simply arrived at the courthouse in a black SUV, her expensive sunglasses hiding whatever emotion she might have felt. The charges against her? Insurance fraud, conspiracy, and, most damning of all, accessory to attempted murder. But the real battle was yet to come. Charles Lancaster, the judge who had spent decades bending the law to suit his needs, covering up corruption, ensuring that men like Grayson could operate without consequence. The footage had been enough to get him suspended, but not enough to guarantee a conviction. Even now, from the shadows, Lancaster was working to save himself. He still had friends in high places, senators, congressmen, men who owed him favors. And Daniel knew that if he slipped through the cracks, the cycle would start all over again. Later that evening, as Daniel was getting ready to leave the hospital, a guard appeared at his door. "There's someone here to see you," the officer said. Daniel frowned. "Who?" The door opened. Mrs. Lancaster stepped inside, wrists shackled, a U.S. Marshal standing just behind her. Daniel tensed, his body instinctively shifting between her and Ava. But Mrs. Lancaster didn't look at his daughter. She looked at him, and she smiled. A job well done, Agent Carter, she murmured. Daniel clenched his jaw. What do you want? She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You think this is the end, don't you? Daniel didn't answer. Her smile widened. Oh, Daniel, she sighed, almost pitying. This system isn't built to break. It's built to adapt. You took me down, but I was just one piece. She leaned in just slightly. And if you think the people behind me are going to let you change anything, you're more naive than I thought. Ava stiffened beside him. Daniel held Mrs. Lancaster's gaze, his pulse steady. Then he stepped closer. Maybe, he said quietly, but you're going to rot in a cell while I find the rest of them. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Doubt. Then the marshal pulled her back, guiding her toward the exit. Mrs. Lancaster didn't resist. She just gave one final glance over her shoulder and said, "Good luck, Agent Carter." Then she was gone. Daniel let out a slow breath. Ava, still watching the doorway, asked, "She's lying, right? It's over?" Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. No, he admitted, not yet, but for the first time in a long time. He believed that maybe, just maybe, it could be. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Defendant Ethan Grayson, on the charges of police corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel watched as Grayson sat motionless, his expression unreadable. The man had spent years thinking he was untouchable, that the system would always protect him. Now, the system had turned against him. Beside him, Mrs. Lancaster didn't flinch as her sentence was read, 30 years for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. She merely adjusted the cuff of her blazer, as if this were nothing more than an inconvenience. But her husband, Judge Charles Lancaster, had played his cards better. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the legal machine had protected its own. The judge walked free, avoiding a prison sentence through carefully orchestrated deals and political favors. Yet his name was ruined, his career shattered. As he left the courtroom, cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, shouting accusations. He no longer carried himself with the confidence of a man above the law. His steps were slower, shoulders hunched under the weight of disgrace. He had escaped a cell, but not the world's judgment. Weeks later, Daniel sat across from a news anchor on national television. The studio lights were warm, the cameras rolling, but all he could think about was the weight of the past few months. Agent Carter, the anchor said, your case has exposed corruption at the highest levels. What do you want people to take away from this? Daniel hesitated. Then, he spoke. That this isn't just about one case. This isn't just about Grayson or the Lancasters. It's about a system that allowed them to exist. And unless we change that system, there will always be another Grayson, another Lancaster, another Marcus Hill. The anchor nodded. Do you believe real change is possible? Daniel looked into the camera. Only if we refuse to look away. Outside the studio, the city hummed with life. Daniel pulled his coat tighter against the evening breeze. Ava walking beside him. She had been quiet since the trial ended, processing everything in her own time. But she was stronger now. Did we actually win? She asked softly. Daniel thought for a moment, then sighed. We stopped them, but winning? That's something else entirely. Ahead, a commotion caught his eye. A young black boy stood on the sidewalk, a police officer towering over him. The officer was asking questions, his hand resting near his holster. The boy looked scared. Daniel and Ava stopped. For a long moment, Daniel simply watched. Then, he stepped forward. Because justice wasn't a single moment. It was a fight, one that never truly ended. In the end, justice isn't about one victory. It's about the fight we refuse to walk away from. Corruption thrives in silence, but as long as there are people willing to stand up, to speak out, the system can be challenged. So what do you think? Was this truly justice? Or just another battle in a war far from over? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths for more stories that expose the hidden battles for truth and justice.